Hi everyone, I'm Nora, and I would love to thank you for coming and joining us today at this Mono Lake moment here on Rush Creek, and also to thank our members and supporters and friends for helping us continue to do the work that we do here at Mono Lake. Despite our stay-at-home order, we are working from home in our office, recreating only in our home basin to get the walks out, get the lilies out, and we just thank you so much for being with us today as I share the beauty of the Mono Basin with you, and today some important history. I'd like to give a quick shout out, a thank you to our member and supporter Dewey Livingston, who donated this lapel mic to improve our sound in these videos. So thanks to Dewey, we are a lot clearer and a lot less wind challenged, and it's been really wonderful to get to know live streaming, so I'm excited to have this new skill. Now, today's Mono Lake moment, we're going to talk about the history of the aqueduct here in the Mono Basin, and I'll share with you why this day, April 15th, is an important day in Mono Lake history. So we're gonna back up in time, and in the early 1900s, engineers from LA, Fred Eaton and William Mulholland, were planning out the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which at the time the plans were to span from the Owens Valley down to LA. But Fred Eaton came to the Mono Basin in 1904, in the beginnings of those planning times, and he had a glimmer of an idea that the Mono Basin would play an important role in the LA aqueduct system. And there are complicating factors. At first it was deemed unnecessary, but in time Los Angeles was growing, so later on it became more of an important part of the plan. So by 1912, the city of Los Angeles had actually acquired about 3,000 acres of land in the Mono Basin. And they didn't have a hard set plan to use the Mono Basin yet, but it was kind of a backup just in case. And eventually the city of Los Angeles was growing even faster than they thought. So originally engineers said the Owens Valley will supply Los Angeles with water with the needs to meet the needs of the people forever. Very shortly, within about 5 to 10 years, forever became today. So in the late 19-teens, about 1919, Los Angeles started through the Bureau of Reclamation, which was a little tricky maneuver, not entirely legal, began acquiring water rights and land rights in the Mono Basin for this public use, for this, at first they said irrigation use, for domestic irrigation, but eventually that changed. And at that time, water was considered to be wasted if it was not used for human uses. So if it was not used for irrigation, for drinking water, for projects, it was considered wastewater. So this beautiful creek behind me, flowing into the lake, naturally enhancing the ecosystem, the habitat, and of course the lake itself, was considered waste. And so Los Angeles was able to acquire land by saying, this water is not being used, therefore it is being wasted, and we would like to use it for a public good. And so in the 1930s, Los Angeles started building this aqueduct. It didn't come without struggle. There were lawsuits to acquire the land from about 78 different defendants, most of whom made deals with Los Angeles to sell their property for a decent price at the time. But about 4 families fought adamantly against at least the price that Los Angeles was offering. And they fought hard, but unfortunately they came to an agreement where they were able to sell their land to Los Angeles. And at that point, Los Angeles had about 30,000 acres, and roughly about half of the land in the Mono Basin. The other half is government land. So in the 1930s, the engineers started building the Los Angeles Aqueduct mono extension. And they started with the Levining Diversion Dam, which is 338 miles from Los Angeles. And that's the northernmost point in the Los Angeles Aqueduct system. And at the time just consisted of a concrete dam that blocked the creek and diverted that water into an underground tunnel that took it around, contoured around the mountains, dropped down, and picked up water from Walker Creek and Parker Creek, which both feed into Rush Creek before it reaches the lake. And the aqueduct continued until it dropped that water from Levining, Walker, and Parker Creeks into the new Grant Lake Reservoir, which had a large dam. And Grant Lake Reservoir collects water directly from Rush Creek. Rush Creek and the headwaters above flow directly into the reservoir, and where it is held, it's the largest reservoir in the aqueduct system. And the aqueduct down to LA basically starts from there. All the water from Levining, the northern creeks, flows into Grant Lake Reservoir, and from Grant Lake Reservoir it flows into a tunnel that actually goes underneath the Mono craters in an 11-mile underground, sub-volcano tunnel. And we'll get to that in a moment. But what happened when these dams were built is they didn't have much forethought about what happens to creeks when you just dry or block them off rather than allowing water to flow in. And so essentially this aqueduct was being built in pieces in the 1930s. And from about 1934, 1935, the tunnel under the aqueduct commenced. And that was a huge project. It required an entire town being built at what is called West Portal. It's now a sagebrush sandy flat with a few Jeffrey pines and a few old foundations. But it once was a bustling, basically contractor town where they housed the folks that were digging, building, and implementing all the tunnel infrastructure. And it was pretty dangerous to be digging underneath volcanic craters that are considered dormant. So they are not spewing lava right now, but the chances that they could aren't that low. So they encountered a lot of toxic gases, vapors, a lot of hot water, and it was kind of a triumph, a pretty amazing feat of engineering that they were able to complete that project, and it still stands today. So once the aqueduct structures were finished in around 1940, Los Angeles started collecting water from Levining, Walker, and Parker and Rush Creeks. Oh, my favorite bird just flew by, a black phoebe. You might be able to see it behind me, right there. Huh. Not common in the Mono Basin except during migration, which is right now, so that makes me very happy. Sorry about that. Birders get distracted, especially a lovely, lovely sight like that phoebe. Where was I? So, 1940. The water was flowing from the creeks into the aqueduct, but not, or from into the reservoir, but not from the reservoir into the aqueduct yet. But on this day, April 15th, 1941, water from Grant Lake Reservoir flowed into the aqueduct and continued down to Los Angeles. And as we all know, this created a pretty drastic change and a pretty huge problem in the Mono Basin. And part of the reason, well, the whole reason the Mono Lake Committee exists today is to fix that problem, do our best to flip the script and restore the Mono Basin streams that were damaged from those diversions, and protect the lake from further harm. So just rewinding back to 1941, when you cut off water from streams that have been flowing for thousands, if not tens to hundreds of thousands of years, it drastically alters the stream channel, the riparian habitat along the stream. And the first few years in the 40s were pretty wet years, so the aqueduct can only fit so much water in it. It's a one-size-fits-all tunnel. It can either fit that much or less. And so when water was melting off the mountain snow into these creeks and couldn't fit in the aqueduct, it would just flow over the concrete dams. And so the first couple of years, the creeks did okay. They didn't dry up completely, except in the winter months. They would occasionally have very, very low to dry flows. And in the later 40s, we had a span of a few very dry winters. And that was when the lakes, or the streams, first really dried up. And so they began this cycle of drying up in dry years and then getting re-watered in wet years when that water couldn't fit into the aqueduct. And so it wreaked havoc on the ecosystem, because when you have this dry period of a creek, the riparian vegetation, the willows, the cottonwoods, the vegetation on the sides, or even in the water, watercress and lilies, their roots dry out and they begin to die. And if you have many subsequent dry years in a row, it can really kill back a lot of important bank stabilizing vegetation and channel stabilizing effects. So then you have a wet year and water all of a sudden comes rushing down these creeks, these now dry, cobble-filled creek beds. It cuts new channels and it fills old channels with gravel, and it changes so much. It fills in important pools for fish habitat, and it will rip out that vegetation that has died and clog the stream down further along the reach. And so many issues happened. At the same time, the lake was beginning to drop, because these tributary streams are the main source of water that fills Mono Lake. And if the amount of water coming in from the streams is less than the amount of water evaporating from the surface during the summer, well, all year, but more significantly during the summer months when it's warm. And so the lake began to drop. And it was predicted in the beginnings that it would drop about 100 vertical feet, and we are really glad that that didn't happen. But thanks to the work of the Mono Lake Committee, California Department of Fish and Game, California Trout, National Audubon Society, and many, many others, we did not see the lake drop that drastically, but it did drop about half of that. The lake dropped 45 vertical feet by the time the Mono Lake Committee formed and stepped in to be a voice for the lake. And so as the lake dropped, the streams actually cut deeper, and within the first 10 to 20 years, the streams had cut about a 12 foot deep into their channels. And that also causes problems in the riparian ecosystem, because the water can no longer flood into flat floodplains that have a seed bank of riparian vegetation. They're just stuck in this channel, and they just cut deeper and deeper until they reach the surface of the lake. So these diversions have, of course, caused many problems in the basin. And today, I just like to express my gratitude for all of the people that came together to defend this place, and how important just the beginning thoughts of David Gaines, of Sally Gaines, of many, many others who said, we're not going to let this happen. And though it took 16 years for a court battle to be won, it really made a difference, just voicing the concerns that the lake could not speak. And so today I am grateful for all of our supporters who continue to help us do this work. But April 15th is a day that I will always think about. Well, normally I think about as Chautauqua registration, but this year I get to think about it as this monumental shift in the Mono Basin that, though it was dramatic and painful for the ecosystem, has, after years of hard work and determination, turned around to become this kind of beacon of hope in the environmental movement, of being able to make change. So in the 90s, the creek beds have been restored in a way. The processes, the ecosystem processes of the streams have been restored by clearing out filled channels and replanting vegetation along the banks of the rivers to help stabilize them. And so now we're seeing Rush Creek in its more natural state. It always has water flowing, it always will. There are fish thriving in the creeks. There are birds nesting in the riparian habitat along the banks. And we can feel good that Rush Creek is on its way to being restored well. And that is a good day. April 15th may have started out rough, but it's nice to be here on this creek and be able to see how much has changed. So with that, I'll leave you to ponder what it is to stand up for your local habitat, your local ecosystem, and your local community.